social. And it's good to have you, my friend, Yaël Ossowski, with us at the Consumer Choice Center and Consumer Choice Radio. His program, alongside his tag team partner, David Clement, airs every Saturday morning just after 10 o'clock. Yaël, it's a pleasure. I hope you're doing well out in Vienna. We are in the Bayou, Lafayette, Louisiana, and we've got some conversations ahead that I think will shine some light on this region of the country, the contributions its people have made to our nation. But first, let's talk about some global issues and this massive cargo ship that remains stuck in the Suez Canal as this $400 million an hour estimation in trade that is being disrupted and may unleash a worldwide toilet paper shortage, just as we were last year at this point. Tough to find some toiletries in many of the grocery stores around the country. And here we are once again. Not much has changed, and this time it's due to a ship stuck in a massive canal that controls some of the world's trade that goes on within our global economy.
Yeah, and I think this is a very good example of exactly why the entire discussion around trade that we've had over the course of the last several years overlooks a lot of stuff, and it's especially this. These are the kind of things that are happening all of the time, these ships that go through canals. You have, these large container ships with hundreds of thousands of products that are loaded to go from one country to the next. All this stuff runs in the background, when we think about taxes and tariffs and we think everything else, but it really is a logistics game. And this is definitely going to be a pretty sticky situation. Plenty of memes have already come up, but there might be a couple Amazon products, Joe, that I'm missing out on, because this is supposed to be headed up to the Netherlands, and Netherlands has a big Amazon warehouse, and they send products to my home in Vienna. So there's probably a couple things I'm missing out of. I'm pretty upset, and I did see actually that there's a lot of American companies that are waiting on imports that rely on some of the cargo in this ship. So it just goes to show how complex our world trade order is. And, when we want to encourage this to hopefully provide more options for consumers, better options and products for many of our entrepreneurs, this is the kind of stuff that we need to have working. So, yeah, we definitely need to get rid of that ship. I mean, we need to have the U.S. military go in there with its own, plow or tugboat. I'm pretty sure our boys could take care of it. But right now it's definitely chalking up world commerce, but it's making for a lot of funny memes online.
All right, not to play Tinfoil Hat Conspiracy here, but we know that Suez Canal has been oftentimes an area that has seen hostility from the countries in that region of the world. Am I going too far out on a limb here and say, well, maybe this was done purposefully and not accidentally? I don't want to go too far out on that limb, but we know that we have seen hostility in that region of the world within that waterway at times before, whether it be this nation or that nation, jumping on cargo ships or stopping ships that peel into their waters outside of that canal. I guess we have to wait till an investigation, but why not just jump on the train here like most media members do and fire a shot from the bow that may be a little outside the curve, but maybe not. Who knows?
Yeah, I think probably it's just, terrible captain. He got a bit distracted, probably checking out the scenes and the sights. What's interesting about the Suez Canal, obviously, is that there was a crisis over the entire, property of the Suez Canal. And it was in 1956, there was the Suez Crisis. And it was at that point that President Eisenhower at the time, he actually did not go to war, but he was able to broker a peace deal and a ceasefire that kept the Brits and the French at bay and fighting with the Egyptians. It definitely is an important thing. I wouldn't put on. I'd probably put the tinfoil hat down for now, Joe. I don't think it's our go-to yet, but keep it warm and ready. There's probably going to be other circumstances here coming up that'll necessitate putting that puppy on.
Well, anything is possible these days, so I'm not going to leave out that theory because we have come to know across various issues and stories that pop up day to day that the unthinkable is very real here in this year 2021. I mean, who would have thought a year ago we would have empty store shelves because we couldn't get toiletries, to the grocery stores. Who would ever thought that we'd be shutting down businesses and schools because the science and the data was telling us to do so? I never really figured out why the CDC thought 6 feet of social distancing was a good start in the first place, and now it's 3 feet, or the whole mask wearing or not wearing a mask only when you're walking into a restaurant, and then you can sit down at that restaurant table without a mask on. But while you're walking the 10 feet from the storefront to the table, you have to have the mask. The Rona doesn't know, when you're sitting down and speaking, maskless. So anything goes these days here, Yaël. So you just never know, what is going to shake out of a certain news story, particularly one that, again, is disrupting so much globally and the economic situation that is taking place right now all around the world and trying to get back out on our feet. Yaël, earlier this week we had a caller because we were talking about the ongoing situation at our southern border, and I know you and I have touched on it just briefly over the last couple of weeks in regards to illegal immigration, of course, with the legal immigration process being discussed in your appearance as well. But our caller pointed out a book known as The Strange Death of Europe. It's a bestseller, and it's talked about how immigration has truly transformed the European Union and how countries are operating these days. And I want to get your take on it, given that you're in Vienna, and a little background on that book and how immigration, unvetted immigration, has changed really the populations and the demographics of certain countries within the EU.
I mean, I knew that I could get informed by listening to the Mornings with Joe Catenacci show, but I didn't think it would happen so early on a Monday when I was listening in. So your caller mentioned the book Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam. So this is by Douglas Murray. He's a Brit. He's very active on, Spectator magazine. He's on British TV. He does a lot of commentary in Canada and in Australia. And his thesis is essentially that European civilization as it exists today will not be able to survive the next 100 years of mass migration, principally from Northern Africa and the Middle East. And in his telling, he's talking about the culture of Europe has essentially been abandoned. There's an abandonment of Christendom, of Christianity. A lot of the European culture has just kind of been mushed together into this European Union idea. And he says that by, this new wave of mass migration coming in with, a very faithful crowd. A lot of the people who are immigrating come from places like Turkey and Algeria. These are fairly religious places. They do hold steadfast to their culture, and that's something that will directly conflict with what is happening in Europe. It's definitely the case, certainly in parts of France. We do see a lot of clashes between many of the Francophone, I would say, Muslims coming from, let's say, Algeria or Morocco, people coming from former French colonies. And in Austria and Germany, it's much the same with many Turks who are also fairly religious. And, he has something to it. And I think the main factor is that Europe itself as a continent is not having enough children to really replace their own population. So really, those numbers will be achieved. The larger numbers in Europe will be achieved by mass migration that comes specifically from these countries. There are not enough Yaël Ossowski type immigrants who come in from North America to Europe. It's mostly from Northern Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the like. It's a very interesting book. I think there's, some ideas I definitely agree with, some I don't. But it does really bring up the debate again. And, Europe is not a continent of immigration. It's not used to it. It doesn't know how to cope. We don't necessarily have in Europe the same style of the American creed where people have, the Constitution and the symbols of freedom and liberty that people can actually get behind. You don't really have that in Europe. Many of the cultures are specifically tied to language, to religion, to older cultures. Whereas in America, we're more tied to our way of life and our principles and the Constitution. And I think that is making a big difference. Many European countries don't know how to deal with this. That's why you do see the rise of many far-right parties in places like France and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and even in Austria. So I think it's a very complex, complicated issue. I definitely recommend the book to some of your listeners who would like to know more. But definitely a great mention on Mornings with Joe Catenacci show. Never know what you can discuss on this program.
Well, and from that, I think that conversation was spawned after we were talking about immigration, but it all started with a comment that you made on Monday because you're a little distraught with how long it took a personal package to get from the States to your home in Vienna. And we piggybacked off that by describing, our pins and needles that we're sitting on every couple of weeks within our small business in how long it takes for a piece of mail to get from one side of town to the other. And you were pointing out that there was, the original argument against, the government controlling much of our lives, particularly within the ability to, send things between households or businesses. And a man by the name of Lysander Spooner, who started the American Letter Mail Company back in 1884 and direct competition with the USPS. Give us a little background on the old Spoon Man and some of the ways he, protested the effectiveness and efficiency of government all the way back in the 1840s.
Yeah, Lysander Spooner is a very interesting figure. So he was a writer, probably more from the anarchist tradition of political philosophy, more of the, I would say, individualist, anarchist, libertarian wing. He was a pamphleteer. He was a political philosopher. He was involved, with a lot of the abolition movement at the time. And he was actually really incensed by the amount of the interference happening by the federal government in businesses. We're talking in 1844. Imagine how it's evolved in 2021. But what he was really incensed about was the post office. He found that the quality of the post office itself was terrible. The prices were too high. They weren't getting letters and packages delivered quickly enough. So he started his own mail company, the American Letter Mail Company, started as a competitor of the post office. He had lower prices. And what's interesting is that Lysander Spooner, by background, he's someone who did not necessarily believe in the authority of the federal government. He believed that the U.S. Constitution was actually too much government. His book, No Treason, discusses that a lot. And it is within the Constitution that we do find mention of the postal services. And that's what he was trying to challenge, is saying like, hey, you have this Constitution, you've listed that we need to have this postal service. I think it's garbage. We need competition. That's the better way that we can serve people. Unfortunately, within a decade, the Congress kind of came in and really made the Postal Service an official monopoly. Believe me, they tried everything to shut him down. They jacked up fees and rates for accessing different ports of entry and different routes. They arrested many of his associates. They would make any contracts that he made with other vendors illegal. So the government did run him out of business, but their prices did go down by a little. So he achieved a little bit. But I think what's more interesting is just that our history is just filled with people like this who go against the grain, who question the status quo, and I think by challenging the rules and trying to provide a good service, we can actually get the good American way. We're seeing that today with a lot of entrepreneurs during the pandemic, and hell, it was even happening in the 1800s by this guy Lysander Spooner.
And, think about this. Back in his time, 1840s, it cost 18 3/4 cents to send a letter from Boston to New York, 25 cents to send one to Washington, D.C. And, Mr. Spoon said that, in fact, I can do it, and I'll do it at 5 cents. I'll be able to send a letter to do it effectively and efficiently. Only in America can we make arguments, as to how we can do things without government control in a more effective and efficient manner. Don't you think this was like the original, maybe one of the original arguments as to why, we should be, having a limited government and the roles and the responsibilities they have over its people?
Yeah, precisely that. And it comes down to federalism. That's a very important principle that, we need to discuss a lot more because it is going to come up. You know, a lot of people are debating in the Senate about who should have this and that vote and whether people should be able to filibuster or something else. And other people are talking about making Washington, D.C. its own state with a few senators. You know, the idea of federalism is very important. The separation of powers is very important. The entire dynamic of states versus the federal government is very important. I mean, that's why we need to have good, accountable people who are in our federal institutions, but also our state institutions. And I think there is much more of that education. It's been something that has been, you know, a thorn in the side of our country's history for a long time, for good and bad reasons. But, you know, the states' rights of many years ago were slavery. Today it has everything to do with pandemic and vaccinations and legalizing cannabis and alcohol laws. So there are ways that we can pursue, you know, good federalism measures to try to improve and make our states just a bit freer. And I'm happy to be doing a part of that, at least every day.
Yaël Ossowski with us from the Consumer Choice Center. Again, you can hear Yaël and David Clement at 10 o'clock Saturday mornings here on the Big Talker FM through their Consumer Choice radio show. Yaël, the last 2 weeks we've kicked off our remote broadcasts 1 week ago from Morgantown, West Virginia, this morning from Lafayette, Louisiana, giving the folks back on the Carolina coast just a little background as to where we are in regards to how this area has impacted the region within their portion of the country and some of the contributions they've made to our nation over the years. And I want to get your insight on the history of the French Cajuns, since we're in Cajun country. I talked about Marquis de Lafayette, who was a general who, in fact, I believe he was portrayed in the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson as the French war hero who came to the U.S. in fight of its revolution, who helped get more support from the French. He was in the siege of Yorktown, played a big role in that final battle for our nation's independence, and that's how this area was formed and its namesake. But talk about the awesome and industrious history of the French Cajuns in Lafayette, Louisiana.
Well, I'll do you one better, Joe. If anyone is a fan of the musical Hamilton, which I know you are, he actually plays a big role there too. So Marquis de Lafayette. I loved the French pronunciations. I thought you actually did a pretty good job. You know, not bad for this guy. So what's interesting about the French Cajuns, we would call them cadiens. They're actually my cousins, Joe. So they were Canadians at one point. They were French settlers. Much like my family was in Quebec. These are the French settlers that were east of Quebec. So they're in what is today known as New Brunswick, northern Maine, all of these kinds of areas. That's where you had French-speaking populations that were loyal to either the British Crown or to the, newly budded United States of America. And there was a large migration once the British had seized control in what was then the British colony in Canada, but now known as Canada. Once the Brits took all the control, they actually pushed a lot of the Francophones and French speakers out, and many of them made the migration down to La Louisiane because it was still French territory at that point, and it was there that this kind of great civilization built up. And there's a great book that I'd recommend that I read just last year. It's called The Cajuns, Americanization of a People. And it talks about the Bayou, it talks about South Louisiana, Lafayette, and in many of these parishes and areas, up until World War II, they were actually majority French-speaking. It was really the Second World War and then the federalization of education in the 1960s that changed the language of the majority of the young people and older people throughout Louisiana. So you have this entire area of the United States where people actually spoke French, they wrote French, they had French newspapers, they were able to participate in business, everything in French. And once the Second World War happened and many of these guys went off to fight in Europe, and they became much more integrated with the rest of the country, that story changed. But it is something very unique in American history. We have, similar circumstances in places like New Mexico, and there it is sort of a bilingual state. But Louisiana is really interesting for that. I was in New Orleans a couple years ago. I tried to go meet a couple of my French Cadien cousins. I wasn't able to meet too many because many of them are much older, but there is a renewed interest, I will say, in the younger people in Louisiana that are speaking French. I have done interviews with a few people there who are speaking in French and teaching French and doing different courses. But it's really interesting to see. It's a great culture, obviously a great state. You're in a beautiful part right now, Joe. It's great to know that we can give a little bit of education to listeners of the Big Talker on a Friday morning.
Yeah, and I get caught sometimes. Am I going too far here and spending a good portion of our program, highlighting where we're at and the formation of this region? I think it's just very an interesting tidbit, and given that the world is filled with all sorts of information that of course we highlight and talk about on a nearly daily basis. We're on a field trip, so why not learn a little bit while we're on it and get a little insight, something that you're going to hear nowhere else. I think that is why we stand out a bit. We have no problem veering off and taking a detour every once in a while. Well, as it relates to the news, the information, the opinions of the day, why not learn a little bit more about this area of the country and its contributions to this great nation and its people.
It's the Joe Catenacci Magic School Bus.
I love it. Let's get on that magic school bus, and we'll go for a ride again on Monday when we get back here from Lafayette. We'll be back with our latest edition of the show as we continue our whole week trip here to the Bayou. Yaël, thanks so much for the time, as always, my friend. Enjoy your weekend.
Yeah, will do, Joe. Thanks so much.
That's Yaël Ossowski once again with the Consumer Choice Center. Once again, we'll be back here on Monday, bright and early, as we play a 4-game series this weekend with the Louisiana Cajuns. Great to have Yaël Ossowski with the Consumer Choice Center joining us every Friday just after 9:30 on the Big Talker FM.